The Handkerchief by Great 78. Chapter 13. Combustion, Concussion, Confession. Hagrid really was stretching the very definition of responsible adult nowadays, Draco thought. First he'd tried to keep a baby dragon in his wooden house. Then he took a bunch of dumb firsties into the forbidden forest at night, then introduced them to hippogriffs in their first real lessons as 13-year-olds. Now, a year later, these... what the hell had he called them? Blast-ended, scooting spoots? Who wouldn't want pets that can burn, sting, and bite all at once? Draco asked the class at large during their first lesson with the godforsaken creatures. Just because they're not very pretty doesn't mean they're not useful. A dragon's blood is amazingly magical, but you wouldn't want a dragon for a pet, would you? You can pet my dragon any time, Granger, Draco whispered, so that only she could hear it. Something in his brain could not help it. It was just right there, waiting to be said. He cringed as soon as the words were out. She flushed a bright red and stuck out her tongue at him. Are you offering a kiss? He drawled quietly. Shut up, Malfoy. The red had gotten even possibly deeper. That was unexpected. Was she enjoying this back and forth? They lapsed into momentary silence as they continued to hold out different food options to either end of the spoots, to no avail, whilst Potter and Weasel were distracted with putting out a small fire in their box, when all four of their freakish creatures spat fire simultaneously. He leaned forwards again. You're looking a little sweaty, Granger. Do you have a handkerchief with which to cool yourself off? He asked innocently. As though she could not help it, a smile crept across her face. She blushed harder and grew even more intent on her spoot things. I do have one. You never know when you might need it, she said primly. Too right, he murmured. The new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor seemed entirely mental, and this was saying a lot. 1/3 of their previous instructors in this subject was actually in a mental ward. Another third lost their ability to reason for a couple of days every month, and the last third had died after apparently being possessed. But the fact that this one seemed to think showing his classes the unforgivable curses in Lesson 1 was a good idea. What was that even about? And what the actual hell was this about? These were the thoughts running through Draco's mind as his white fur-covered body bounced painfully across the ground, the laughter of his classmates echoing loudly in his head. The hospital ward was quiet, too quiet, Draco thought. He was used to the snores of Vince and Greg, and the intermittent glub and gurgle of the giant squid in the Black Lake. His throbbing head and shoulders did not help. Madame Pomfrey had healed the fractured skull and shoulder, as well as the dislocation. She was working on the concussion, but said that after effects might last for a few days. He'd taken a mind-relaxing potion for the concussion. It made him a bit loopy and talkative. He'd already told Madame Pomfrey that her hands were soft, but that her nose was far too big for her face. She'd given him a vial of pain potion some time ago, but had warned that the pain would worsen significantly in a few hours, and that it could only have one vial every 4 hours. So he was waiting, holding out as long as he could, but it was getting worse by the minute. On edge in the too quiet, he easily heard the creak of the front door, even though it was apparent that whoever it was making the greatest effort to be quiet. Who's there? A paranoid part of his mind worried that it was Moody, coming in to break the other shoulder. It's me, a soft voice answered. A bright light from the hallway suddenly illuminated a riot of curls, leaving no doubt as to who it was. Come to finish me off, have you? He asked with what he hoped sounded like a hardened grimace, but probably sounded more like a whimper. clamping his teeth together to stave off the pain. "Are you all right? Were you injured?" She drew nearer, but still not close. "Yes, Granger. I'd say a fractured skull, a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and broken ulnar and humerus bones are an injury. Wouldn't you?" He bit out, sweat breaking out across his forehead, with the effort to not groan in pain. This witch had seen him at his worst far too often, and Merlin help him, he would not moan and cry in front of her. "Oh my God! Moody really was out of order. Doing that, can I sit with you?" He wanted to say, "Merlin, yes, I'd love that." But his brain told him to play it cool and just say, "Sure, if you want to." Unfortunately, his mouth was not listening to his brain at the moment. "Merlin, yes, I'd love that." Ah, hell. If his head weren't already killing him, he would smack himself senseless. She drew up a chair quietly, right next to his bed, and settled on it. "Why did you warn me? At the Quidditch World Cup?" "What?" The question had caught him off guard. Because. Because what?" The pain and the mind-relaxing potion were making him far too honest. "Because I was worried about you, Granger. My father—" Here he tried to stop, but then realized that the words were already coming out of his mouth. "My father was angry this summer about the hippogriff. He lost his position on the board of governors for Hogwarts, and he blamed you and Hagrid. I was afraid he would go looking for you." "Malfoy?" She reached out a hand, grazing his wrist as though afraid she'd hurt him worse. "Why do you call me Malfoy? It's not my given name, you know." He attempted a smile, which came out as grimace. "Why do you call me Granger?" She smiled. As she spoke, she moved from the chair to sit on the edge of the bed, and withdrew the white handkerchief from her sleeve, placing it in an empty bowl on his bedside table. Muttering a quiet aguamenti, and pointing her wand into the bowl, she withdrew the wet cloth, wringing it out slightly and placing it on his forehead. The cooling relief was instant. He relaxed so completely he could hear his audible sigh and didn't have the temerity to feel even the least bit embarrassed. "Because you call me Malfoy." She laughed at this, and Draco marveled, realizing it had been nearly 3 years since he'd heard her laugh this way. Those moments in the forest seemed so long ago. "I'll call you Draco, if you call me Hermione," she said primly. "What is so many syllables?" He whined jokingly. "Well, Ron often calls me Hermione. You can always do that." She smiled slyly. "No, thank you. I'm not a lazy ass like the weasel. I can manage 4 syllables. "Don't call him that," she admonished. "Are you seriously telling me he's not already calling me a ferret?" Draco demanded. She sighed. "Yes, he is." She chuckled again, then reached up to turn the handkerchief to the cooler side. "Feel better?" "Loads better, thanks. Now, if I can hold off this headache and shoulder ache a while longer, I can take another one of those pain potions in an hour or so." Without a word of warning, she took his hand and began vigorously rubbing the space between his fingers and thumb. "What are you doing, Hermione?" Her eyebrows raised slightly at the sound of her name. "Well, Draco," she said pointedly. A warmth spread quickly in his chest. "This is an acupressure technique I learned years ago. My father used to get headaches, and we didn't always have pain reliever at home. This helps." Draco had to admit it seemed to be working, though perhaps it was the fact that she was holding his hand more than anything. "Do you know of a way to help with shoulder pain?" he asked after a moment. His shoulder and upper arm felt like it was on fire. "Lie on your stomach." His eyebrows climbed into his hair. "What?" "I'll massage your back. That might help," she said, without meeting his eyes. Privately, Draco thought that it might help something, but he wasn't sure if it was only his back. He was treading on very shaky ground here, if his jittery insides were anything to go on. He slowly, gingerly turned first on his side, then his stomach, taking care to cushion his arm next to his head. The chill air of the hospital ward rushed over his back as she lowered the sheet. Nothing happened for a moment. He waited, listening, but didn't even hear her breathing. "Enjoying the show, Hermione?" he asked jokingly to break the tension. He cringed again. This mind-relaxing potion still had his mouth moving about 5 seconds faster than his brain. "Hush," she said hurriedly. "I was just... hush." She began to rub, tentatively at first, but harder as it became clear from his very involuntary moans that he appreciated it. "Draco, can I ask, what are these little tiny scars? They're almost like a fan pattern." "Ah, yes. Well, my father was angry, and he threw a glass towards me, you see. It shattered, and some of the glass must have gone through my clothes." This was partly true, and Draco congratulated himself that he was able to clean up the story a bit, even in his hazy state. It had been a thrown glass, and it was thrown by his father, but Lucius had magically hurled the small shards at his back after the glass had broken, purposefully digging them there into Draco's shirt, so that they would pierce his skin. There had been a lot of drunken yelling over his grades, his failures in making a name for himself. Then Lucius had used the Cruciatus curse on Draco because of his class ranking. Pym had picked out what shards he was able to find, and Draco had hoped a shower would remove the rest. His back itched and burned in spots for several weeks after. "How old were you?" she asked softly. "This was, after first year, so 12. He closed his eyes, ashamed. "Oh my God!" Her hands stilled, spread across his back. "Did your mother know?" "She knows a bit. Not always the big stuff, but I don't want her to say too much against him. He's hurt her too, but not as bad. Whatever I can do to protect her, I do." "Draco!" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't worry about it. There's nothing you or anyone else can do about it. I just have to stay on his good side. Say the things he expects to hear, spout back the nonsense he tells me. Some of our schoolmates, they talk to their parents, and their parents are his friends. If I just keep up the insults and the pureblood stuff, and keep my grades high, it'll be fine." He was absolutely certain that he wouldn't have been this talkative without the mind-relaxing potion, and if he'd had to look Hermione in the eyes whilst talking, but facing away from her, he found the words tumbling out. She slowly began rubbing his back again, gently, the muscles relaxing under her touch. The ache in his arm lessened, but her touch caused electric currents to surge through his body. After a moment, Hermione stopped and asked, "Any better?" "Much," he said, his body still tingling with the power of her touch. "I'm sorry this happened to you. This thing today. Professor Moody was out of line, and about the glass thing with your father." "I suppose I was being a bit of a git today. Well, lots of days." This slipped out before he could stop it, but if anything it made Hermione smile, so it wasn't the worst thing to say, clearly. She picked up the discarded handkerchief from where it lay on the bed next to him, dipping it once more in the water and placing it on his brow. "Thanks for coming in here, Hermione. Merlin, it's hard to think of you as anything but Granger." He smiled weakly. "Well, perhaps in mixed company we keep it to surnames and insults." She laughed quietly. "I'm having a hard time picturing calling you Draco in front of Harry and Ron." "I don't know. I think if you start the conversation with that right hook of yours, no one will even notice." This elicited a true laugh from her. I really shouldn't have done that. I apologize.
I deserved it.
No, Draco. You don't deserve violence. Her eyes flickered down to his bandaged arm and shoulder. None of it.
Just do me a favor, Hermione. Next time you want to punch me, maybe don't. Cut a bloke some slack, perhaps. Maybe just pinch me, or tickle me, maybe a kiss.
The last one had slipped out of his mouth unexpectedly, and Draco's eyes widened, as did hers. Unlike in Care of Magical Creatures class, this one had not been a stupid joke. He could almost see the word hanging physically in the air, tempting him to try to pull it back before it reached her ears. Her copper eyes burned suddenly at him in the low light. He met her gaze almost timidly. "Maybe," she whispered, equally as timid. Haltingly, achingly slowly, she leaned slightly forward towards him. He rose as smoothly as he could onto his good elbow, pain forgotten entirely at this moment. Their faces were only about 6 inches apart now, mercurial silver eyes shining at blazing copper ones. She leaned slightly more, her eyelids closing. The squeak of a doorknob and the soft rattle and clink of potion vials broke the moment. Hermione gasped, then fell sideways over his lower body, much too close to the embarrassing situation currently going on below deck. Thankfully, she was too distracted by the entrance of Madame Pomfrey to notice. From under her thigh she withdrew a silky, supple bit of fabric, swishing it quickly around her body. In an instant she had disappeared. Of course, she had an invisibility cloak. She'd probably charmed the hair off of a demi-geis herself. Draco felt the mattress shift as she stood and moved away. As Pomfrey leaned over him, talking to herself about the bandages, he saw rather than heard the front door open. His head fell back onto the pillow, mind still adrift. She had been about to kiss him. He was almost certain. After everything he'd done, every sodding insult he'd hurled at her and her friends, she'd still almost kissed him. Something cold trickled down his cheek. It was water from the cooled handkerchief. In her haste, she'd left it with him. He removed it from his forehead, gripping it tightly in his uninjured hand. He'd need to return it to her. Swallowing the pain potion, Draco felt his body and mind relax gently. He felt like he was floating, and it wasn't just from the potion. Suddenly, the pain seemed trivial. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great78.